my name is Serena Calloway. I am 34 years old. And on a Thursday evening in April, in front of 11 people sitting at a dinner table I had set, in a house I had decorated, over a meal I had cooked from scratch over 2 days, my husband of 7 years looked across the white linen cloth at his boss and laughed. He said, "Oh, you know Serena. She keeps herself busy with her little craft hobby. Candles, ribbons, that sort of thing. It is cute." He picked up his wine glass and smiled. His boss smiled back. Someone made a joke about artisan everything these days, and the table laughed, and the conversation rolled on like a wave that had already forgotten the shore it just covered, and I sat at the far end of that table with a cloth napkin folded across my lap and a single number sitting quietly in the front of my mind. $4.2 million. That was the assessed value of the commercial building his company had been leasing for 9 years. The building I had purchased 11 days earlier, in my name, through my company, with money I had earned building the thing he had just called a little craft hobby in front of 11 witnesses. I did not correct him. I did not flinch. I did not set down my fork or clear my throat or exchange a meaningful glance with anyone across the table. I folded my napkin once along the existing crease, smoothed it back onto my lap, looked at the colleague to my right, and asked whether she would like more roasted potatoes. That was the moment I stopped being the woman in the background of someone else's story and started becoming the one who owned the building. The story was told inside. This is that story. To understand what happened at that dinner table, you have to understand how I got there, not to that house, not to that marriage specifically, but to the particular kind of invisible that takes years to build around a woman before she even notices the walls going up. I grew up in Claremont, Virginia, the second of 3 children. My mother, Ruth Adler, worked the front desk at a physical therapy clinic on the edge of town for 22 years. My father, James Adler, drove regional freight routes that kept him away 3 nights a week for as long as I could remember. We were not poor. We were careful. There was always food on the table, always school supplies in the backpack, always one family trip to Myrtle Beach in July. What there was not was excess. And what there was not, for me specifically, was the particular kind of deliberate encouragement that gets handed to the child a family has quietly decided to be proudest of. That child was my brother Ellis, 5 years older, engineering degree from a state school. A man my father described to every neighbor within earshot as the one who figured it out. I was not the one who figured it out. I was the one who was pleasant, steady, organized, and would, as my mother said to relatives on no fewer than a dozen occasions, I can still hear word for word, land on her feet. She said it warmly. She meant it as a compliment. It took me years to understand that in the vocabulary of the women in my family, landing on your feet was not a compliment so much as a permission slip to stop paying attention. She will be fine. Move on to someone who needs more. I started making candles when I was 22 years old. The summer after I graduated from Claremont Community College with an associate degree in business administration that nobody in my immediate family attended the ceremony for because my brother Ellis was closing on his first house that same weekend, and my parents needed to be there for that. I made the first batch in the kitchen of my 1-bedroom apartment using a second-hand double boiler, a candy thermometer I found at a thrift store, and $6.40 worth of natural soy wax I bought from a craft supply store 3 blocks from my building. I sold that first batch to coworkers at the insurance office, where I was doing data entry at the time. 8 candles, $8 each, $64 total. I sold the second batch at a church sale the following month. The third batch I listed on a website I had built myself, on a Sunday afternoon, using a free template and a domain name I paid for with money I had set aside from skipping lunches that week. By the time I was 24, the business I had named Wren and Cedar was generating $4,000 a month in revenue. By 25, it was $11,000. I kept my own books in a spreadsheet I had designed, reinvested 90 cents of every dollar back into the operation, and told almost no one outside of the customers buying from me. Not because I was deliberately hiding it. because no one in my life at that time asked. And when no one asks, the habit of silence settles in before you even name it. I met Garrett Calloway at a mutual friend's engagement party in the fall of the year I turned 25. He was 31, a mid-level sales director at a commercial real estate firm called Ashworth Property Group, charming in the specific way that men who have been told they are charming their entire lives carry that quality, which is to say effortlessly and without requiring anything in return. He was funny in rooms. He was attentive on dates. He brought me sparkling water without being asked, because I had mentioned in passing 20 minutes earlier that I preferred it over still. I found that extraordinary at the time. It seems like a small thing in retrospect, but when you have grown up being the one who notices what other people prefer without being noticed yourself, someone remembering your sparkling water feels like being looked at squarely. We dated for 8 months. We married in June on a Saturday afternoon at a vineyard venue outside Richmond that I partially financed because Garrett's savings were, as he explained it, tied up in some investments he was managing. I did not ask which investments. That was the first of several things I chose not to look at directly. I made that choice with both eyes open, and I own it fully. The early years of the marriage were good in the way that early years often are, which is to say they were full enough that the spaces between things did not yet show clearly. I was happy in the particular way that a person who has been given a little more room than they previously had is happy, which is genuinely and with some relief. Garrett was generous with attention, easy to be with in the day-to-day mechanics of a shared life, and the house we occupied together was warm in a way I had not always had access to growing up. Garrett moved up at Ashworth Property Group to senior director by the time I was 27, a promotion he was right to be proud of, and which I celebrated with him without reservation. We bought a 4-bedroom colonial on a cul-de-sac in Glenwood, 40 minutes outside Richmond, with a 2-car garage and a backyard Garrett described to every visitor as impressive for the price. He told the story of how he had found it, negotiated it, landed it. He told it with the satisfaction of a man who is very good at a specific thing and knows it. The down payment came from the Wren and Cedar business account. That part of the story Garrett did not tell. Garrett knew the business existed in a general way. He knew it was, as he occasionally said with the warmth of someone describing a pleasant surprise, doing pretty well. He did not know the specific revenue numbers. He had never asked for them. Not once in the years we had been together, and I had not volunteered them, partly because every time I had tried to move the conversation in that direction, it would arrive somewhere that sounded like enthusiasm, but functioned as a door quietly closing. "That is so great, babe. You should look into selling at the farmer's market on Saturdays," said warningly, said without any awareness of how completely it missed the actual scale and structure of what I was describing. As though the natural ceiling of what I was building was a folding table and a handwritten price list and a Saturday morning crowd who bought things on impulse between the coffee stand and the vegetable booth. I began to understand, gradually and without drama, that in Garrett's mental landscape the thing I was doing occupied a category that had a fixed size: small, sweet, contained. The kind of category that does not require updating because it does not seem to grow. He had filed it there early, and the file had not been reopened. I do not believe he chose that consciously. I believe it was simply the limit of what he was curious enough to look at, and I was not, at that point, ready to do more than notice it. By the time I was 29, Wren and Cedar had outgrown my apartment kitchen by so many orders of magnitude that the comparison would have been funny if I had allowed myself to find it funny. I had a full production studio I was renting in a light industrial park 12 miles from the house, 7 part-time employees, a distribution contract with a regional home goods retailer covering 4 states, and a product line that had expanded from candles into room sprays, linen mists, and a seasonal diffuser collection that had sold out in its first 3 weeks on the market. Revenue that year came in at $782,000. I had retained an accountant named Patricia Owens that same year, a woman in her mid-50s with silver reading glasses on a beaded chain who reminded me of no one in my family and therefore felt immediately trustworthy in the way that people outside your original story sometimes do. Patricia sat across from me at her desk in our first meeting, went through my books line by line, looked up at me over her glasses, and said, "You have been running a real company this whole time." I told her I knew. She said, "Does your husband know?" I told her he knew it existed. She nodded once, put her glasses back on, and did not ask anything else. We got to work. Garrett's habit around my business was not malice in any visible form. It was something more structural than that, more ambient, like a low-frequency hum you stop noticing precisely because it never stops. It was the language he used at parties and dinners and the informal gatherings that filled our social calendar. The way he described what I did to other people without consulting me first, and without the description bearing any resemblance to the actual enterprise I was running. "Serena's little candle thing," said always with warmth, always with a small, affectionate smile, the tone of a man reporting something charming about someone he loves without understanding what he is describing. Colleagues' wives would ask me about it, and I would tell them, directly and accurately, that it was a company with a studio and a team and a distribution contract and a specific revenue figure I was willing to name because I had long since stopped treating money as an impolite subject. They would say, "Oh, how wonderful, how fun," and Garrett would appear and say, "She's being modest, she sells candles online, she's very creative," and steer the conversation somewhere else. I would stand in those rooms holding a glass of sparkling water that someone had remembered to bring me, counted by the room, but not seen by it, and I would do the arithmetic in my head and say nothing. The first moment I registered it clearly as a choice he was making, rather than an innocent habit of perception, was at his company's holiday party in December 3 years before the dinner. I was speaking with a woman named Claudette Marsh, the wife of Garrett's regional director at Ashworth, and she was asking me about the business with the focused interest of someone who had some context for what operational scale looks like. She asked about sourcing. She asked about the distribution chain. She asked whether I managed the inventory forecasting in-house or outsourced it. I answered all of it honestly and specifically. Then she leaned back slightly and said, "That is not a hobby. That is a company." And at that exact moment, Garrett drifted into range of our conversation, caught the tail end of what she had said, and without a beat of hesitation said, "We like to keep her grounded." He laughed. Claudette smiled in the polished way that women smile when a room has just confirmed something they suspected. I watched Garrett turn back toward the drinks table. His shoulder turned away from us both, and I felt something settle into place in my chest. Not anger, exactly. Something that had the structure of a decision but had not yet found its specific form. The second moment came 14 months before the April dinner. We were at Garrett's parents' house in Fredericksburg for Easter Sunday. His mother, a woman named Patricia Ann Calloway, who had managed the Calloway household for 38 years and treated that fact as a credential that outranked most others, asked me in the kitchen how the crafting was going. I told her it was going well, that we had just signed a distribution renewal that would bring us into 3 additional retail regions by the 3rd quarter of the year. She said, "Oh, that is darling." Then she called Garrett in from the living room and announced to him that his wife was so industrious. Garrett looked at me across the kitchen with that particular smile he had, the one that meant he was performing a version of pride that required no actual understanding of its subject, and said, "She keeps herself busy." That phrase, "keeps herself busy," the specific condescension of it, so gentle, so apparently warm, so completely hollow. I drove back to Glenwood that Easter Sunday and sat in the car in the closed garage for 6 minutes after Garrett went inside. Patricia Owens had sent me a year-end financial summary that morning on my phone. Annual revenue, $1.3 million. Net margin, 41%. I looked at those numbers, and then I looked at the phrase, "keeps herself busy," sitting in my head like a pebble in a shoe. Then I called Patricia Owens and said, "I want to start talking about the next step." She said, "I have been waiting for that call." The next step? As Patricia and I had been circling for the better part of 18 months in the careful language of people who are planning something real and do not want to plan it carelessly, was acquisition. Ren & Cedar had outgrown its rented studio space in a way that was no longer a future problem, but a present one. The lease renewal was coming due at the end of the year, and the landlord had raised rates twice in 24 months and sent language in the most recent renewal notice that made clear a third increase was not a possibility but a certainty. I had run the numbers myself and then asked Patricia to run them again independently, and both sets of calculations told the same story. We were paying for the privilege of making someone else's building more valuable while absorbing cost increases that ate into margin every single quarter. I had also begun to understand, through the research Delia was compiling for me, that owning the production space was not simply a cost efficiency play. It was a stabilization of the entire enterprise. A rented studio is a business that can be disrupted by someone else's decision. An owned building is a business that has removed that particular category of risk entirely. Patricia's recommendation, and the recommendation of Delia Grant, a precise and thorough woman who wore the same style of structured navy blazer every time I saw her and spoke about commercial property, the way a surgeon speaks about anatomy, with specific language and no wasted sentiment, was that I stop renting and start owning, not just the studio square footage we currently occupied, a full building, one that could house production on the lower levels, administration and design above that, and generate stable rental income from additional commercial tenant units that would help service the acquisition debt and reduce my effective occupancy costs substantially over time. Delia had been sending me listings for 11 months. I had toured 4 properties in person and found something genuinely problematic with each one. The first had structural issues in the freight elevation system that would have cost more to remediate than the price reduction justified. The second was in a location with deteriorating transit access that my team could not absorb. The third had a lease situation with a sitting tenant that would have required litigation to resolve cleanly. The fourth had bones I liked, but a parking configuration that did not work for the delivery logistics I was running 7 days a week. I looked at each one carefully, documented my reasoning in a file I kept on my desk at the studio, and told Delia every time that we were not there yet. She was patient. She had been in commercial real estate for 22 years, and she had the particular equanimity of someone who understands that the right property and the right moment are rarely the same thing as the available property at the current moment. The 5th property I saw on a Thursday morning in February. I knew within the first 10 minutes of walking through the front door that it was the one. 6 stories, constructed in 1982, updated mechanicals within the last 8 years, a lobby with its original terrazzo floor intact and in good condition, a freight elevator that operated smoothly and could handle the production equipment I was planning to move, and 2 long-term commercial tenants already occupying the upper floors and generating income that would help carry the building from day one. 48,000 square feet on the south side of Richmond, 4 blocks from a transit hub, with a parking structure underneath that had been included in the sale. Assessed value, $4.2 million. Asking price after Delia's negotiation with the motivated seller, $3,800,000. What I did not mention to Delia in the moment I noticed it, what I registered and held quietly in the front of my awareness while she walked me through the second-floor layout, was what I saw when I stepped into the lobby and looked at the tenant directory mounted on the wall beside the elevator bank. 3rd line from the top, Ashworth Property Group, Suite 310 through 360. Garrett's Company, the company where my husband had worked for 11 years, been promoted 3 times, and where his boss of the past 4 years, a man named Darren Price, who ran the regional division and who came to our house for dinner twice a year and shook my hand every time and said, "Serena, what a lovely home," had his office. Garrett's employer was a tenant in the building I was considering purchasing. I stood in that lobby for approximately 45 seconds, weeding that directory. Then I turned to Delia and said, "Pull the full lease terms for every tenant before end of day." She said she would. I walked to the freight elevator, pressed the button, and rode it alone to the 2nd floor. Now I want to stop here for a moment and speak to you directly. If you are watching this and you have ever been the person in your relationship or your family who was quietly building something real while someone who was supposed to see you described it with the wrong word, I want you to drop a comment below right now. Tell me you are here. Tell me where you are in your own story. Because what happened next took 11 months. Every dollar of reserve capital in the Wren and Cedar business account. A commercial acquisition loan I qualified for entirely on the company's financials without Garrett's name anywhere on the application. And a level of sustained composure that I did not know I possessed until the moment I was required to demonstrate it. Subscribe if you want to see how it ends. I promise the ending is worth the patience it took to reach it. The purchase closed on a Tuesday afternoon at 3:47 in a conference room at Delia's firm, with Patricia Owens sitting at my right hand and an escrow officer named Helen who called me Ms. Calloway in a tone that told me she understood exactly the weight of what was being transferred across that table. The deed was filed under Wren and Cedar Holdings, LLC. My name, my company, my building. Garrett was in Charlotte, North Carolina, at a sales conference for Ashworth. He had texted me at 12:03 that afternoon to ask whether we had any plans for Friday evening. I texted back that we did. I had already sent the invitations 4 days before the closing. 10 guests, all from Garrett's professional world. His boss Darren Price and Darren's wife Michelle. His senior colleague Marcus Webb and Marcus's partner. 3 additional couples from the wider Ashworth circle. People who had been in our home before, who knew Garrett's name, who would be in the room when the story changed. I cooked for 2 full days. Duck confit with a cherry and red wine reduction. A roasted beet and walnut salad with shaved fennel and a citrus vinaigrette. Twice baked potatoes with Gruyere, chive, and a precise amount of white pepper that I had tested 3 times in the preceding weeks. A chocolate torte with a salted caramel center that I had also tested 3 times because the caramel broke the first 2 attempts and I was not willing to serve a broken caramel to 11 people at a table I had specific plans for. I set the table with the white linen I had purchased the previous Christmas, the good silver that had been a wedding gift we had not used enough, and candles from my own autumn collection in hand, poured amber vessels arranged on a hammered brass tray down the center of the table. On the evening of the dinner, Garrett walked through the dining room at 4 in the afternoon, looked at the table and said, "You really go all out for these things." He said it warmly. He meant it as an appreciation. I thanked him and went back to the kitchen. The guests arrived between 6:45 and 7:15. Darren Price came through the front door with Michelle and a bottle of small batch bourbon he pressed into Garrett's hands at the threshold. He turned to me, shook my hand, and said, "Serena, what a lovely home." Same 4 words, same tone. 4th time I had heard them in 4 years. I thanked him, took his coat, and directed them toward the bar cart in the living room. The table filled. Wine was poured. Conversation moved through the room the way it always did at these gatherings, comfortable and social and full of the kind of professional familiarity that makes even strangers at a dinner party feel like they have known each other for years. Garrett was animated. He was at his absolute best at these dinners, relaxed and funny and generous with the laughter that made people feel welcome, the kind of host who ensured everyone felt they were at exactly the right party on exactly the right evening. I watched him from my end of the table and felt, to my own surprise, not resentment. Something quieter and more settled than resentment. Something that felt like the calm that arrives after a very long preparation when the thing you have been preparing for is finally, specifically, here. It was Michelle Price, Darren's wife, who turned toward me during a natural lull in the table's conversation and asked about my work. She was 4 seats to my left, and she leaned forward slightly with the genuine curiosity of a person who has thought to ask before and kept forgetting and finally remembered. She said, "Garrett mentioned you have your own business, Serena. What do you do?" I said, "I run a home fragrance and lifestyle company called Wren and Cedar. We produce and distribute candles, room sprays, and diffuser collections. We are in several retail regions across the Southeast and Mid-Atlantic, and we recently expanded the production footprint significantly." Darren looked up from his plate. He said, "Interesting. What kind of scale are we talking?" And before I could draw the next breath, before I could answer a direct question from the man whose company leased 4 floors of my building. Garrett set down his fork and said it, the same way he always said it, lightly and easily and without hesitation, as though it were simply true and universally understood. "Oh, you know Serena. She keeps herself busy with her little craft hobby. Candles, ribbons, that sort of thing. It is cute." He picked up his wine glass. He was smiling, not at me, past me, at Darren, in the easy lateral way that men sometimes smile at each other when they are performing a shared understanding about the charming peripheral activities of their wives. The table did not pause. Conversation resumed within seconds. But Michelle Price looked at me. Not for long. 1 full second, direct and perceptive in a way that told me she was the kind of woman who noticed the things other people agreed not to notice. I met her eyes. I smiled once, small and certain. Then I turned to the colleague on my right and asked a question about a renovation project he had mentioned earlier. I did not say a single corrective word. I did not adjust the record. I did not signal anything to anyone at that table. I ate my duck confit. I refilled water glasses. I asked whether anyone would like more potatoes. I was the easiest, warmest, most present version of a dinner party host for the remaining 2 hours of that evening, and underneath all of it I was perfectly, deliberately, completely calm, because I already knew what was in the envelope on the dining room table, and I already knew that 11 people had just heard the setup. After dessert, and after the bourbon had gone around a second time, and after the conversation had loosened into the easy overlapping kind that marks the last hour of a dinner party that has gone well, and after the last set of headlights had reversed slowly out of the cul-de-sac and disappeared down the street, and after Garrett had stood at the front door for 10 minutes saying his particular brand of warm and generous goodbyes that left every guest feeling they had been his favorite person in the room, he came back inside and found me in the kitchen at the sink. He had a dish towel and the satisfied, slightly loosened expression of a man who has hosted something he is proud of. He leaned against the counter beside me and said, "Darren really likes you, by the way. He always says you are gracious." I turned off the tap. I dried my hands carefully on the towel hanging from the oven handle. I looked at my husband, who was comfortable and warm and had no idea what was about to happen. I said, "Good. That will be useful." He laughed. He heard it as a pleasantry, a small joke at the end of a good evening. I was not making a pleasantry. I said, "Garrett, will you come sit in the dining room for a few minutes?" The tone of my voice was the same as it always was, calm even, without signal. He did not detect anything in it. He folded the dish towel over the oven handle, said sure, and followed me in. The table was still set. The candles had burned to their last quarter inch. In the center of the table, in the 4 minutes between the last guest's leaving and Garrett coming back inside from saying goodbye in the driveway, I had placed one document face down between the 2 remaining wine glasses. I sat down. He sat across from me. I reached forward, turned the paper over, and slid it toward him. It was a single-page summary. Property address, 410 South Canal Street, Richmond, Virginia. Building name, The Meridian. Total square footage, 48,000. Purchase price, $3,800,000. Buyer, Wren and Cedar Holdings, LLC. Date of closing, Tuesday, April the 8th. Current tenants, 2 long-term commercial occupants. Gross annual rental income from existing tenants, $62,000. His eyes moved down the page. The room was quiet except for the last candle guttering slightly in its vessel. His face remained still for 4 full seconds, which is a very long time for a face to remain still when it is processing something it was entirely unprepared to receive. Then he looked up. I watched his expression search for a frame that would make this information fit somewhere he already understood. There was no such frame. "You bought a building," he said. Not a question. A statement that was really a recalibration. "I did," I said. He looked at the paper again. "When did this close?" "Tuesday. 3:47 in the afternoon. You texted me at 12:03 asking about Friday plans." He stared at the address. "This is the building on South Canal." Yes. That is where Darren's office is. Yes. Suite 310 through 360. I reviewed the lease terms before I made the offer. Ashworth Property Group has 4 years remaining at current rate. The lease is structured cleanly. Your company is a reliable tenant. The word tenant landed in the room like a stone dropping into still water. He heard it. I watched him hear it. His mouth opened and then closed without producing a sound. The little craft hobby, I said, not with heat, not with performance, simply with accuracy, has been generating enough revenue to qualify for a commercial acquisition loan for some time. Wren and Cedar has been a real company since before you and I met. A very long pause. How long? He said. His voice had dropped to something I had not heard from him before. Patricia and I have been planning this specific acquisition for 18 months. The business crossed 7 figures in annual revenue 3 years ago. He looked at the candles, then back at the paper, then at me. I didn't know, he said. I know, I said. You didn't ask. The silence that followed was not cinematic in the way silences are in films. It did not have a score behind it. It was the specific and ordinary silence of a person who has been handed a mirror at an unexpected moment and finds the reflection different from the one they had been carrying in their head. Garrett sat at that table for a long time after I stood and went upstairs. I do not know precisely what he did with the quiet. I know what I did. I washed my face in the bathroom sink. I sat on the edge of the bed and looked at my hands, which smelled faintly of cherry from the duck reduction I had been tending since 2 in the afternoon. I thought about a woman in a community college library who had taught herself double-entry bookkeeping from a library book because she could not afford the supplemental course text. I thought about $6.40 worth of soy wax in a paper bag. I thought about Patricia Owens saying, "You have been running a real company this whole time." And I thought about Michelle Price looking at me across that table in the single second after Garrett said "little craft hobby," and how her expression had not been pity. It had been recognition. In the days following the dinner, Garrett moved through the house with a new kind of care. He did not argue. He did not attempt to reframe or minimize what had happened. He did not perform injured surprise or shift into defensiveness. He asked questions, which was new. He asked how the distribution arrangement worked. He asked about the retail partners and which regions were performing best. He sat at the kitchen table on the following Sunday morning with his coffee cooling in the mug and the 1-page summary still in his hand, having apparently kept it, and he asked me to tell him about the building. So I told him. I told him about the 6 stories and the terrazzo lobby and the freight elevator and the 2 anchor tenants and the $62,000 in annual rental income that would service part of the acquisition debt from day one. I told him about Delia Grant and her structured blazers and 11 months of property listings and 4 tours before the right building appeared. I told him about Patricia Owens and the financial modeling and the commercial loan application and the closing on a Tuesday afternoon while he was at a sales conference texting me about dinner plans. I told him all of it, directly and without performance, the way you tell someone the truth when you have been waiting for them to be genuinely ready to hear it. He listened to every word without interrupting. When I finished, he set down his mug and was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I called it a little craft hobby in front of my boss." I said, "You did." He said, "In front of 11 people." I said, "Yes." Another pause. Then he said, "I am sorry, Serena. I did not see you." I looked at him across the kitchen table. I thought about what sorry meant and what it cost and what it was worth. I said, "I know you are sorry, and I need to know what changes." Sorry is a place to start from. It is not a place to arrive at and stay. He nodded. He looked like a man who understood the specific difference between those two things. I chose to believe that he did. That is the honest answer about where we were. Marriage is longer and more complicated and more genuinely interesting than any single moment of revelation inside it. And the man I had married was a person with layers and histories and habits he had not chosen consciously, as I was, and some of those things we were still sorting through, the way actual people sort through actual things, imperfectly and with effort and without a clean ending visible yet. What I had ended was not the marriage. What I had ended was the performance of smallness, the accommodation of the version of me that fit inside someone else's description of my life. That performance was finished. It had a closing date. It was a Tuesday in April at 3:47 in the afternoon. The professional consequences arrived quietly at first and then with more volume. Garrett had to tell Darren Price. Not the full story in all its detail, but the essential relevant fact. His wife was now the building owner, their landlord. I was not present for that conversation. 3 days after the dinner, I received an email from Darren Price directly. The subject line read simply, "Congratulations, Serena." The body of the email said, "I owe you an apology for laughing along at the table. I did not understand what you had built. Wren and Cedar Holdings is a significant acquisition. I look forward to being a tenant." I read it twice in my office on the second floor of the Meridian building, which is where Wren and Cedar's administration team had begun setting up the previous week. Then I forwarded it to Patricia Owens with one line, "For the file." Patricia responded 4 minutes later with a single word, "Perfect." Michelle Price called me 9 days after the dinner. She did not reference the dining room directly or what had been said across the table. She did not bring up Garrett or Darren or the moment Garrett had smiled past me. She simply said, "I would love to see the studio sometime, if you are open to visitors." I said I would genuinely enjoy that. We scheduled a visit for the following Thursday morning. She arrived punctually, wearing flat shoes and carrying a small leather notebook. And she spent an hour in the production space asking specific and well-formed questions that told me she had some operational background of her own that she had never mentioned at any of the dinner parties I had attended alongside her. She asked about the sourcing process for the fragrance compounds and how I managed quality consistency across production batches. She asked about the fragrance development timeline from concept to shelf. She asked about the specifics of the distribution contract and how the retailer managed inventory replenishment. She asked about the staffing model and how I had built a part-time team that could scale up for seasonal volume without carrying the fixed cost year-round. She took notes. She did not perform admiration. She simply wanted to understand the thing accurately, which is the most genuine form of respect I know. On her way out, she paused at the double production doors and looked back at the room for a moment. Then she said, "I knew something was off about the way he described it. No one sits that still when they are being dismissed unless they already know something the room does not know yet." I thanked her. She said, "I am going to tell people about this company." She meant it. Within 6 weeks, 3 separate inquiries had come in through the Wren and Cedar website from people who cited Michelle Price as the referral source. One of them became a wholesale account representing one of the better-performing regions we had entered that year. I sent her a small box of the autumn collection with a handwritten card. She sent back a note that said, "Worth every candle." The production team moved into the Meridian building on the 1st of May. On a Monday morning at 8:14, I drove into the parking structure beneath the building I owned, swiped the access card that had my name printed on it, took the freight elevator to the 2nd floor, and walked through the double production doors into the space that had been ours for 31 days, and which we were occupying for the first time. The room smelled like bergamot and cedar and warm poured wax, which is the specific combination of smells that has meant something to me since I was 22 years old, standing in an apartment kitchen with a second-hand thermometer and a paper bag. 7 members of my team were already there when I arrived. Equipment was being positioned. The ventilation system was running. Someone had tested the pouring stations and left small test candles cooling in a row along the windowsill that faced south toward the street. And above the main production line, hung that morning without any instruction or request from me, was a piece of craft paper, the width of the wall with hand-lettered text in black marker. It read, "Wren and Cedar, established in a kitchen with $6 and a thermometer." I had not asked anyone to make that sign. I had not told that particular detail to more than 2 or 3 people in the 7 years since it was true. Someone had found it somewhere, in an interview I had given a trade publication the previous year, or in something Patricia had mentioned, or perhaps simply because stories like that travel in the way that true things sometimes do. Whoever had made the sign had decided it belonged on the wall of this room, above this line, on this first morning. I stood in front of it for longer than was professionally appropriate for a business owner on a production start day. Then I turned to the room. I said, "All right, let us get to work." And we did. Within 4 hours, the line was running at the kind of pace that told me we were going to be fine here. More than fine. I want to say something directly to you now, and I want to say it simply because it is true and because I think some of you need to hear it in plain language without decoration. There is a particular kind of loneliness in building something real next to someone who does not see it, and I do not want to minimize that by rushing past it toward the outcome. The loneliness is real. The hours of working, when no one asks how it is going, are real. The specific interior experience of sitting at a table full of people who laugh at a joke made at the expense of your work and choosing not to correct the record, and carrying the truth quietly like a stone in your coat pocket is a real and significant thing to carry. I carried it for years. If you are carrying something similar right now, I see you. I want you to know that the carrying is not weakness, the silence is not defeat, and the patience is not the same as giving up. If you are the person in your home, in your marriage, in your family, who is building something real in the hours that other people do not see or ask about, and if the person who is supposed to believe in you most has instead settled into a comfortable habit of describing your work with the wrong words, I want you to know that the wrong words do not determine the right outcome. They never have. I know what it costs to hear your work reduced to a hobby, your plans treated as pastimes, your ambition described as cute. I know the specific interior weight of sitting in a room full of people who can see you but are not looking at you. And here is what I learned in that dining room on a Thursday evening in April, with 11 witnesses and a document sitting face down in the center of my own table. You do not have to raise your voice. You do not have to correct anyone in the moment. You do not have to win the room on the night it happens. The truth does not require your performance. It requires your patience, your precision, and your willingness to keep building when no one is watching. Build the thing. Know every number. Sign the document when the time comes. Then fold your napkin and ask if anyone would like more potatoes. The room always catches up eventually. Every single time. The question is only whether you will still be sitting at the table when it does. I was. And I have no plans to leave. There is something Patricia Owen said to me in the first meeting we ever had together, before we had discussed structure or strategy or anything more specific than the basic shape of what I had built over the preceding 4 years. She'd gone through my spreadsheet line by line, a document I had formatted myself on a Tuesday evening while Garrett watched the game in the other room with the volume turned down low. She reviewed it in complete silence, which is how Patricia does everything, methodically and without performing the process. Then she put down her pen, took off her glasses and looked at me directly and said, "Do you know what the most valuable thing in this document is?" I assumed she was going to cite a specific figure. The revenue number for the most recent quarter, the margin percentage on the diffuser line, the distribution contract value. She said, "The fact that you kept going when nobody was watching." I want to stay with that for a moment because I think it is the most important sentence anyone has ever said to me in a professional context, and possibly in any context. I have thought about it approximately once a week, for every week since that afternoon in her office. What no one prepares you for when you decide to build something in the quiet is that the quiet is not the obstacle you will have to overcome. The quiet is actually the structure. It is inside the silence, in the hours before anyone asks how it is going, in the evenings when the spreadsheet is open and no one is watching, in the months when you reinvest instead of reward yourself, that you find out with complete clarity what you actually know and what you are genuinely capable of, and what you are truly willing to risk. Because in the quiet, there is no external validation available to substitute for those answers. You cannot borrow confidence from someone else's applause when there is no applause. You have to generate it from the work itself, from the numbers, from the evidence that accumulates line by line in a document that no one asked to see. And when you find those answers alone, they belong to you in a way that nothing and no one can remove. Not a dismissive phrase at a dinner table, not a smiling husband with a wine glass, not 11 witnesses who heard the wrong description of your life and moved on to the next topic. The building is still yours. The deed is still filed in the county recorder's office. The number is still exactly as true as it was when you first understood it. None of those facts require anyone's permission to remain real. They simply are. And you simply know them. That is a kind of wealth that does not appear on any balance sheet, but is the foundation of every line on every balance sheet you will ever produce. My name is Serena Calloway. I am 34 years old. I run a company inside a building I purchased with money I made from $6 of soy wax, one second-hand thermometer, and 12 years of working without an audience and without anyone asking how it was going. Garrett's boss pays me rent now. The lease has 4 years remaining at a rate I reviewed before I signed the purchase agreement. I set a very good table, and I intend to keep doing both of those things for a very long time. If you have ever been dismissed by the person who was supposed to know you best, I want to hear from you. Tell me in the comments what you would have done at that dinner table. Would you have corrected him the moment he said it in front of everyone? Or would you have let the document do the talking? There is no wrong answer. I want to know where you are in your own story, because this channel exists for every woman who is still in the building phase, still in the quiet, still being described with the wrong words by someone who has not yet looked closely enough to use the right ones. You are not invisible. You are early. And that is not the same thing at all. Before you go, I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for spending this time here with Serena's story. You did not have to, and you chose to, and I do not take that lightly. Every single person who watches, who comments, who shares a story from this channel with someone they think needs to hear it, is part of why we are able to keep showing up here every day. This channel is built on exactly the same principle that Serena built her company on: consistent effort, specific intention, and faith that the right people will find you eventually. If this story meant something to you today, if it landed somewhere real, please share it with one person in your life who is building something quietly and needs to be reminded that the quiet is not evidence of failure. It is evidence of focus. Hit subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss what we put out next. We are here every single day. We are not going anywhere, and we are so glad you are here too.